a chapel bell that would not ring, a boy's voice lost to the heights, and beneath the ancient stone tower, something far more unsettling than silence. In a village where every note is sacred, what happens when music becomes a mystery? What time is it where you are? Where are you tuning in from? Let me know in the comments. Settle in, and let's begin the story. There are places where the wind seems older than the stones it brushes, and where silence does not come from peace, but from something waiting. St. Ethelred's chapel stood thus, not so much built as grown into the moor, its weathered roof hunched like a monk bowed in unending prayer. It had no spire to pierce the sky, only a squat bell tower, lichen-cloaked and brooding, from which the voice of God was expected to fall in iron tones. The moor itself approached the chapel like a question, grey and vast, with its shifting winds and low groaning of hidden streams, yet never seemed to enter. It stopped at the low stone wall like an animal respecting an old, invisible leash. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of wax, age, and the sort of wood that remembers every hymn it has heard. Only one window remained fully unbroken, and even that was clouded like the eye of a saint long turned inward. It was here, under this heavy dome of time and moss, that the villagers gathered to sing to heaven, though sometimes they wondered if heaven still heard. Among them was a boy whose presence did not fill the space, but rather clarified it. Thomas Elwell was not an ordinary child, and he did not seem to know it. His voice, pure, unwavering, and strangely sad, rose through the chapel like a column of pale flame, illuminating nothing, and yet making the darkness feel intentional. When he sang, even the mice in the rafters fell still. He was 13, though he carried silence with him like a man burdened by memory. The other boys teased him, not cruelly, but uncertainly, as if his stillness might catch. He answered few questions, but listened always, not to people, but to walls, to wind, to bells that hadn't rung in years. It was Mr. Kelling, the choirmaster, who had first said the boy's voice was like light trapped in stone. Whether he meant it as compliment or concern, none could tell. Thomas seemed to take it neither way. He sang because he must, because the notes were not his, but given, and to silence them felt like theft. It was on the evening before the feast of St. Cecilia that someone heard the note. Not a song, not a verse, but a note, as if a single pearl had been struck against the sky and refused to fall. The chapel had emptied, and the sun had fled, and yet from within the walls came that one lingering sound, clear, plaintive, impossibly suspended. The vicar, passing by the chapel gate, stopped mid-step. He told himself it was the wind, or a trick of the eaves. But the wind does not weep, and eaves do not pray. Inside no candle glowed, and yet the sound remained. Later, Martha the charwoman would insist she saw Thomas slip into the chapel alone, hymn book tucked beneath his arm like a folded wing. She'd muttered something about shadows and foolishness, but no one had listened. They rarely did when Martha spoke of shadows. But that night even she did not sleep well. Morning broke with an ungodly stillness. Even the birds at the edge of the moor seemed to have lost their appetite for the dawn. It was young Geoffrey Pike, arriving early to polish the organ pipes, who first saw the body. Thomas lay at the foot of the bell tower, not sprawled, but crumpled, like something precious that had fallen from careless hands. His choir robe, damp with dew and stiff with dust, clung to his narrow shoulders like a shroud stitched in haste. His face bore no violence, only an absence, as if the breath had been called back to its maker in mid-note. The door to the tower stood ajar, and the rope, usually looped like a serpent in slumber, hung in a single, straight line. There was no blood, no mark of struggle. Only the boy and the bell above him, unmoved. Father Wilton arrived shortly after, crossing himself before he even saw the body. "God have mercy," he murmured, though it was unclear for whom. The village spoke in hushed tones that grew no quieter with time. The boy had fallen, yes, but something remained. A cry, they said. a sound that lingered like incense too long in the air, curling in corners long after it should have vanished. Some swore they'd heard it just before dawn, a note climbing and then clinging to the sky like a question left unanswered. Others claimed the echo was not musical at all, but a warning, or worse, a plea. And though no two villagers could agree on what they heard, all admitted to hearing something. Mr. Kelling was seen at the chapel doors that morning, standing utterly still. He said nothing, not even when spoken to. Only once did someone claim to hear him mutter. It should not have ended on that note. And the bell, silent since, had still not rung. The feast of St. Cecilia was not cancelled. Perhaps it could not be. The altar was already draped in scarlet, the incense readied, the choir robes hung in patient, trembling expectation. Yet the air within the chapel felt thickened, as though the music that once filled it now resisted return. A place had been left for Thomas deliberately, some said. Others claimed it was simply too painful to rearrange. The choirmaster said little, and what little he said was clipped and devout. He rehearsed the children as if raising them from the dead. When the organ struck its first notes, even the faithful flinched. Something was wrong in the rhythm, something too hollow in the harmony. The choir sang, but each face was turned inward, and high above them the bell tower watched in silence, as if waiting for the one voice that would never rise again. The hymn books were opened, but one stall remained untouched. No one mentioned Thomas by name, yet his absence hung louder than any melody. Even the youngest chorister, too young to understand death, glanced nervously toward the empty space, as if expecting the boy to return and scold their pitch. When the choir sang, "Blessed are the pure in heart," the phrase trembled. Whether from emotion or misgiving, no one could say. Claver's hands hesitated once on the keys, a pause as slight as breath, but those attuned to such things felt the earth shift. The echo that returned from the chapel's ancient walls was thinner than usual. Some claimed it was the acoustics, others thought it proof of something else. Father Wilton said the chapel had always been a place of echoes, but that some were made not of sound, but of silence that had once been a song, and that silence had only just begun. The villagers did not gather so much as they drifted toward the chapel, toward one another, toward the space where a boy once stood and now did not. And as they moved, they murmured, in the way that people do when silence has not been earned, but inherited. No one claimed to know what had happened, but all felt in their own way that something had been taken, and that the taking had not been done by human hands. "He was always different," said the baker's wife, though she had once been fond of his voice. "Too heavenly for this place," murmured an old woman, as if the moor itself had rejected him. They did not say murder, not yet, but they did not say accident either. It was as if the boy had vanished not into death, but into judgment. And judgment, as all in that parish knew, could come without violence or verdict. Only the vicar walked with deliberate silence, his eyes on the chapel floor, as though afraid to look up. For in that stillness it was not grief that chilled the bones, but something stranger, a sense that the boy had sung something he ought never to have known. It was Mr. Kelling who finally broke the hush, though even his voice seemed to fall short of conviction. He stood before the altar like a man preparing a lesson, not a lament. His posture was correct, his tone exact, but his words hung like incense that refused to rise. He was devout, Kelling said carefully, but there was always something unsettled in his spirit, a restlessness I fear he was struggling against, inward temptation. A few heads nodded, not from knowledge but from habit. The phrase had an ecclesiastical shape, even if its content remained vague. Temptation could mean many things, and in the folds of that uncertainty, Kelling tucked his meaning like a blade beneath a robe. He often improvised, the choirmaster added. Unwritten harmonies. He said they came to him. But such liberty can be the mask of pride. There was something in his voice, not grief, nor even anger, but a form of chastisement worn like a borrowed coat. It fit poorly, yet none dared tug at the sleeve. Only the vicar frowned, and somewhere behind them the bell tower held its silence like a held breath. The figure who arrived just before the rain was neither large nor imposing. He wore a shabby brown cassock and carried a walking stick more out of rhythm than need. Most would not have noticed him if not for the faint look of apology he wore, as if he had stumbled upon someone else's grief and had come only to return it gently. Father Brown had been invited by the vicar weeks prior for the feast of St. Cecilia. That the feast would now follow a funeral did not change his purpose, though it certainly altered his prayer. He did not ask questions, nor did he offer condolences. He merely listened with the peculiar intensity of one who suspects that even silences lie. When he looked toward the chapel, he did not see a tragedy. He saw a problem. But like all true priests, he did not look for answers in scandal or suspicion. He looked, first, for the soul that had left, and for the shadows it might have stirred before departing. The interior of the chapel bore all the signs of recent devotion: straightened cloths, polished candlesticks, and the faint lingering of incense that clung to the stone like memory. But Father Brown's eyes did not rest on any of these. Instead, they paused, unmoving, on the second stall from the front, on the left side of the choir. It had not been touched. The others had been smoothed, straightened, even blessed, as if the living were trying to earn their place among the departed. But this one remained still, a small hymn book open, as though the boy had merely stepped away. And yet, something in the untouchedness disturbed the priest more than if it had been desecrated, for to leave a place as it was is not always reverence. Sometimes it is fear. He stood for a long while, then finally sat low, like a child or a penitent, and stared not at the empty stall, but at the space just beyond it, as though expecting something, voice, shadow, answer, that had not yet arrived. The hymn book was ordinary, except in that it was not dusty. The pages had been turned recently, some too often. In the dim chapel light, Father Brown's hand passed gently over the paper, and he paused where the ink of the staff lines had run, not from printing error or dampness, but from human contact. A thumbprint, a smudge, a tear. The priest did not need to count the psalms to know which had drawn weeping. The melody was simple, childlike, even, and yet it rose at the end, defying the gravity of grief. He turned the page slowly and saw in the margin a tiny scribble, barely legible. "They do not understand the song." Brown did not speak aloud, but the phrase seemed to echo anyway. He closed the book quietly, and for a moment seemed not to move at all. When he finally looked up, it was not toward heaven, but toward the bell rope, which hung near the apse like a mute accusation. Something, he thought, had tried to sing, and had been silenced. There was no reason to examine the bell rope, and perhaps that was why Father Brown did. It hung just as it always had, a length of woven fibre, pale with age, suspended from the tower's hidden mouth. But when he drew near, his eyes narrowed, not with suspicion, but with something gentler. Recognition, perhaps. The fibres were frayed, not with time, but with haste. And where the twist should have been taut, it sagged, as though something weighty had passed through it and not returned. He reached out and touched it, not to test it, but to read it, like a blind man might read a page. Then he let it fall again. "Ropes," he murmured. "I like words. Their meaning lies in the tension." He glanced upward toward the tower, and then downward toward the floor, where a single strand of broken cord lay near the choir stall, unnoticed by all. And it occurred to him that the boy had climbed, but not to ring the bell. He had climbed to listen, to a silence no one else believed could speak. They were still speaking of sin, those gathered near the sacristy door. The baker's wife again, the butcher, a few elderly women who smelled of lavender and certainty. They spoke in low tones of weakness and early calling, and phrases such as "the Lord knew best." but Father Brown had always found it dangerous when the righteous spoke too quickly on behalf of God. He did not interrupt them, he merely passed by, nodding amiably, as though he were thinking of something entirely else. In truth, he was. He wandered back through the nave with his hands behind his back, eyes lowered, not in humility, but in observation. Dust told stories that lips would not. A faint smudge by the archway. A wax drip far from the altar. The scent of old oil, but not from the sanctuary lamp. He paused near the bell tower door again, but did not open it. Not yet. He knew what others did not, that some murders are not born of hatred or passion. Some are born of holiness mistaken for law, the kind that silences a boy for singing too freely. As he stood there, beneath the place where the rope had once rung true, Father Brown tilted his head, not in doubt, but in prayer, and waited for the next small lie to betray itself as truth. Rumour, like incense that has grown too thick, does not clarify the air, but chokes it, and so it was with the whispers that began curling around the chapel organ and around the man who had returned to it. Mr. Edmund Claver, once gone and now returned, had not yet spoken a word about the boy's death. That silence, too, was noticed. They remembered things now, or said they did. His sudden departure from another parish, the vague scandal that had hovered like fog over a spring morning, never quite revealing the shape beneath. Something inappropriate, someone muttered, with a pupil. The details were always just out of reach, as if the truth were a key lost in the dark, and only the suspicion remained. The fact that Thomas had been seen speaking to Claver meant everything to some and nothing to others. But in this place where bells no longer rang and voices had been stilled, it was enough to raise a question. And in such villages a question, if it lingers long enough, becomes an answer. The organ had not wept so strangely in years. It was Martha, again, who claimed she heard him. Past midnight, long after the chapel should have slept, she had passed by and paused, not from piety, but from habit, and there it was. The music, deep and slow, moving like something remembered rather than composed, a lament without lyrics. Others, too, spoke of it. They said the notes sounded broken, or worse, unfinished, like prayers that had lost their destination. Claver never admitted to playing at those hours, but he never denied it either. He simply looked out of the chapel window with that same expression, not of guilt, but of something older, something like defeat. The organ was a voice for those who had none, and Claver's music was not so much a message as a memory. Yet memory, in certain contexts, can seem dangerously close to motive. Father Brown, standing near the font, listened one morning to the last note of Claver's prelude and said softly, "It is a strange thing to confess through the pipes of a dead man's song." The quarrel, like most that involve the innocent, had grown in size only after one of its speakers could no longer confirm or deny it. Some said it happened during rehearsal, others near the vestry steps. All agreed that Claver had been angry, though none agreed about what. Some said it was Thomas's persistent improvisation. Others whispered of something more personal, though no one quite dared name it. "He raised his voice," said one boy, wide-eyed and solemn. "I think he called him reckless." Or faithless, another suggested. But music, as Claver understood it, was both faith and recklessness entwined, and if there had been frustration, it was not born from cruelty. At least not the kind that makes headlines. It was, perhaps, the anger of a man who had once believed in something that no longer believed in him. Father Brown, overhearing the muttered accounts, said nothing at first. But he frowned in that particular way he did when the sin being discussed was not the one being committed. Judgment, like dust, settles where it is not swept. And in the chapel aisles, where light fell through coloured glass in fractured ribbons, the judgment of the village crept in quietly, speaking not in condemnation, but in implication. "He's not right," said a parishioner softly, as if the very organ pipes might be listening. He speaks to no one, walks at odd hours. Has that look in the eye, the look that doesn't meet yours. What they meant was simpler. He did not belong. And in villages such as this, that was accusation enough. A man of music, solitude, and past whispers could not hope to defend himself, especially when his notes were stranger than his words, and his words too few. Even the vicar, though careful in speech, had grown more distant. There was a coolness in the way he passed Claver at the end of morning prayer, like a candle moved just out of reach of its wick. Only Father Brown lingered, staring not at the man, but at the silence that followed him, because silence, in its way, is often the loudest voice in a room of prayers. When at last Claver was approached, not by accusers, but by the cautious kindness of the vicar, he offered no plea, no indignation, only stillness. He did not argue the rumours nor explain the quarrel. He did not mention Thomas's name. He merely sat near the back of the chapel, hands folded like a monk without vows, and looked upwards, but not at heaven, at the rafters, as though they too had once held voices now fallen quiet. It wasn't like that, he said at last, to no one in particular. Then after a pause, he sang thing no child should have known. There was neither anger nor pride in his voice, only a kind of weathered reverence. And it was then, perhaps, that even the most devout whisperers began to wonder if they had misunderstood what exactly the man was mourning. Father Brown, who had said nothing thus far, merely leaned against the doorframe and considered that some griefs are so deep they make one look guilty simply for surviving them. They spoke on a Tuesday after the bells had not rung, and the chapel smelled faintly of wet stone and old wood. Claver had just finished tuning the organ, an act more meditative than mechanical, and Father Brown, who had wandered in without ceremony, stood behind him for some time before speaking. "You loved his voice," he said quietly. Claver's hands paused. "No," he replied, with the honesty of sorrow. "I envied it." Father Brown said nothing, which encouraged more than any question might have. "He sang without needing to think," Claver continued. "It just came. The kind of music that feels like it was written before the world." "And that frightened you?" "No," said Claver, now turning slightly. "It humbled me." They sat together for a moment, two silhouettes against the stained wall. Brown's gaze wandered toward the broken rope and back. "He was not troubled," Claver added, "but he made me feel I was." Father Brown nodded, his small figure still. "Sometimes," he said, "we mistake what is pure for what is dangerous, because it shows us how clouded our own light has become." He did not accuse, he did not excuse. He merely waited as the last note of truth trembled somewhere just above both their heads. Inspector Lewis was a man who believed in tidy notebooks and untidy shoes. The latter came from trudging lanes no one else thought to walk, the former from a belief that truth, like numbers, could be totaled if recorded often enough. He questioned every choirboy with the same tone he used for poachers, and scribbled statements with dutiful intensity, as though the ink itself might solve the case. He measured the bell rope, tapped the tower stones, and made a note that boy likely fell from significant height. It was, to his credit, not incorrect, but not quite right either. What Lewis could not see was that not all crimes live within the bounds of motive and method. Some dwell in the cracks of conscience, and in the unspoken arrangements between sorrow and silence. Father Brown, meanwhile, watched him with gentle admiration, the way one might admire a compass for always pointing north, even when north was not where one needed to go. Father Brown preferred older guides. He moved through the churchyard with the slow, unassuming air of someone counting rather than searching, counting not the stones but the spaces between them, as if those gaps said more than the names themselves. A priest's wisdom, he often thought, did not come from sermons, but from the pauses in them. He paused at the low wall where the moor pressed inward and bent slightly, not in reverence, but in recognition. The soil was soft here. Too soft. Not from burial, but from something that had landed or perhaps knelt before rising again. Behind him a crow croaked once from the roof. It sounded less like a cry and more like a warning, though Father Brown had never believed much in omens. He did, however, believe in patterns, the kind that emerge not from logic, but from attention. And in the chapel's shadow the earth had spoken something no testimony had yet dared utter. Martha, the charwoman, had known many chapels and cleaned most of them unwillingly. She was not one for piety, but she was fond of children, and it was that fondness, gruff and unpolished, that led her to speak. He was a quiet boy, she said, her mop pausing against the flagstones. But frightened. You could see it in the way he moved, like someone who didn't want to wake something. Father Brown asked nothing. He simply waited. "I once found him in the vestry," she went on, not hiding, but listening. "Said there was a whisper after the hymn. I told him it was the wind in the roof beams, but he said, 'It don't come from up.'" She laughed then, but there was little mirth in it. He said it followed him, said it hummed. The priest tilted his head slightly, not in doubt, but in recognition. Many children fear monsters beneath their beds. Some, however, know to fear what sings just out of sight and just behind the soul. The moss along the bell tower's southern stones was undisturbed, except where it wasn't. Father Brown knelt, though not with the scrutiny of a detective. His hands rested upon the stones like one might touch a bruised face. Where the moss had been parted, there was no violence, only absence, as if someone had once stood there, trembling and tall. The brokenness wasn't jagged but soft, like a breath exhaled too hard or a step taken too quickly. He looked up, toward the gap in the tower's parapet, and then down again. A footprint had been made, not in soil, but in silence. He traced a faint smudge on the edge, chalk, perhaps, or candle ash. It meant little to Lewis, but much to Brown. For the language of the chapel was not carved only in scripture or hymn, but in the wear of its stones and the silence that hung between its bells. And this silence had shape, a shape made by fear, by faith, and by something else that had climbed and fallen, not from height, but from grace. It was far from the altar, too far, in fact, for a votive's drift or a careless acolyte's spill. Just beyond the transept arch, where the dust thickened and feet rarely wandered, a single fleck of candle wax clung to the stone like a whisper unspoken. Father Brown knelt beside it and stared, not at the wax, but at the absence around it. Candles belong to rituals, and rituals have rhythm. This wax had no rhythm. It had been lost, or hidden, or carried in secret. He recalled the boy's hymnal and the margin scribble that read, "They do not understand the song." Perhaps it was not only a song they did not understand. He looked upward toward the bell tower door again and let his eyes rest there, not in suspicion, but in sadness. For wax has no voice of its own, yet it speaks when placed wrongly. And something had been placed here, near no altar, in a corner where worship does not go. Only worry. To the constable, the stones formed nothing more than a flaw. To Father Brown they formed a confession. There was a rhythm in the way the flagstones had been worn. A child's path, perhaps, or a pattern of pacing. The boy had moved here often, and not by chance. He had walked in circles, a sacred geometry known only to his fears. Brown followed the curve with his eyes, then with his steps. It led not to the altar, nor to the exit, but toward the bell tower again. Always the bell tower. A chapel tells its story in footsteps, and this one told of repetition, of ritual, of a child who returned often to the same place, not to be seen, but to be near something no one else seemed to hear. Brown looked up at the great wooden beams, then down once more. The boy had been trying to reach something, but whether it was sanctuary or surrender, the priest could not yet say. What he could say, quietly, inwardly, was that the chapel's stones had already begun to weep. There are silences which disturb, and silences which accuse. But there are some that bewilder, not because they are empty, but because something once meant to speak has chosen not to. On the morning of St. Cecilia's feast, the villagers had waited, if not for joy, then at least for ritual. The toll of the chapel bell, long dormant except on feast days, was to have rung out in memory of the choirboy whose voice would not rise again. But the bell remained still. It was not weather, nor neglect. The sky was clear enough, the hands willing. And yet, when the rope was pulled, there was no answering clang, only a peculiar resistance, as if the heavens themselves had tugged back. Some said it was God's sorrow, others his displeasure. The more pious spoke of mysteries, the more practical muttered about frayed fibres and rust. Father Brown listened to both camps without comment. He did not believe in broken machinery or divine protest. He believed rather stubbornly in causes, and in men who confuse the sacred with the symbolic. It was the vicar who accompanied Father Brown into the bell tower. His steps were dutiful but distracted, his conversation trailing off like a half-remembered hymn. He had always found the tower unsettling, not because of its height, but because of its echo. Things whispered there in ways they did not elsewhere. The rope lay in a limp coil near the floor, its end split and curling like an old fern. Father Brown knelt beside it with his customary stillness and ran 2 fingers along the fibres, not with a technician's scrutiny, but as a man might touch a relic. "This was not time," he said simply. The vicar looked up. "You mean it was cut?" "No," said Brown. "It was pulled, too quickly, without reverence, with fear or urgency." The pulley creaked faintly overhead, not moving, but remembering movement. The priest's eyes followed the rope's path upward, where dust floated like tired incense. "A boy climbing in haste," Brown murmured. "Or someone climbing after him." The vicar swallowed audibly. But Father Brown had already moved to the steps, his eyes clouded not with fear, but with a patient curiosity far older than any rope. The steps that spiraled within the bell tower were uneven, not from age alone, but from use that lacked purpose. They were worn not by worshippers, but by wanderers. And it was there, halfway to the summit, that the vicar finally spoke what had clearly long weighed upon him. He liked the height, he said it made the notes feel cleaner, less cluttered by breath. Father Brown turned, not surprised. "Clarity can be a dangerous addiction," he said. "I never thought he'd climb without permission," the vicar added, almost apologetically. "But he said the sound up here was nearer to heaven. Not louder, but truer." They reached the bell platform. The mechanism loomed above them like a slumbering beast of bronze, its mouth sealed and solemn. Brown walked slowly around it, fingers trailing against the wood, as if listening for confessions not written in ink. He paused near a window, where the wind whispered. "Children reach upward," he said. "Not only because they want to grow, but because they think the world will make sense when seen from above." He did not say whether the boy had found such sense or lost it. The heart of the bell tower was not the bell, but the gear that dared to move it. Brown stood before it now, not as an engineer, but as a man examining a conscience. It was a large, dignified contraption, part iron, part wood, and wholly honest about its age. But something had been done to it. The catch, which should have turned smoothly when the rope was pulled, bore a thin score along its base, as if it had resisted force not intended for ceremony. A splinter hung from the lever's edge, torn not by decay, but by decision. Father Brown reached into his coat and retrieved a handkerchief, though not for cleanliness. He pressed it lightly against the gear, then stepped back, nodding once. "This was never meant to ring," he said softly. The vicar frowned. "But then—" Brown raised a hand. "Oh, the boy may have climbed to hear the bell, but someone else made sure it would not answer him." He turned his gaze downward, not as if seeking proof, but as if hearing a sound the rest had missed. "Even silence," he said, "can be rehearsed." The loft was narrower than memory made it, but darker in a different way. The wind came in through narrow slats and spoke only to those who stood still long enough to hear it. And in that hush, Father Brown did not search. He waited. And something, as always, revealed itself. Tucked behind the slanted beam of the eastern wall, wrapped not in cloth but in dust, lay a hymn book. Not one of the parish's copies, this was smaller, hand-stitched, and too worn to be used in any formal liturgy. Brown reached for it without hesitation, as one might accept a confession. Its cover bore faint initials, T.E., and the ribbon was still caught between 2 pages near the end. He opened it slowly. The notation was precise but unusual, variations, alterations, lines of harmony that did not match any known version. Between the bars, tiny phrases had been written in a boy's careful hand. Not lyrics, but thoughts, not sacred, but searching. The priest closed it gently, as if it might still be warm. "Hidden," he whispered, "but not lost." Then, as the wind moved once more behind him, he turned the book to the final page, and found words scratched in haste. The scribbles were not musical, they were not even grammatical, but they had the rhythm of desperation. "The notes are wrong. He says it isn't sacred. I only sang what I heard. It follows." Father Brown sat cross-legged near the window where the page had been left open, not reading the words, but breathing them, as if their meaning clung not to ink, but to air. "They do not understand the song," he murmured, recalling the earlier margin. The boy had not written a confession. He had written a resistance, a pleading, not for pardon, but for permission to sing what others refused to hear. And someone, perhaps, had decided that such songs were not to be sung. There was a smudge near the corner, ash or soot, or the press of a finger unwashed by fear. The priest closed the hymn book and held it in his lap like an urn, as if it might still echo. Some songs end too early. Others never begin. And this one, he thought, had been strangled between the two. He descended the tower slowly, not because of the steps, but because of the sound, or rather the absence of it. The bell above had remained mute, even as a boy had ascended in trust. The rope had failed, or perhaps refused, and somewhere between those 2 silences, the one of brass and the one of flesh, something had been buried. Father Brown carried the hymn book under one arm as if it were still unfinished. The vicar waited at the base of the steps, but said nothing. It was not a silence born of ignorance, it was the silence of one who has begun to suspect. Brown glanced once more toward the mechanism, then toward the choir stalls below. "No," he said at last, "the bell did not fail to ring because it was broken." The vicar looked puzzled. "It did not ring," the priest continued, "because it was never meant to mark time." He laid the hymn book gently on the stone ledge by the choir gate. It was meant to mark truth. Then, without explanation or sermon, Father Brown stepped into the aisle and began walking quietly toward the place where truth often hides, the shadows beneath the music. In every parish there is someone whose presence passes beneath attention, though not beneath time. Mr. Hobb was one such figure, the chapel's verger, its sweeper, its unseen sentinel. He moved through corridors like dust, always present, rarely noticed. And he did so in silence, not by temperament, but by fate. He had not heard a voice in 20 years, yet there was a ritual in his silence. He polished the candle holders as if they were relics, aligned the kneelers like runes, and never touched the bell rope. Not once. Since the boy's death, some had begun to wonder whether silence could be suspicious. They asked what Hobb had heard that night, forgetting, of course, that he could not have heard anything at all. But Father Brown did not forget. He watched the verger from the transept, not with suspicion, but with a peculiar form of trust. For in a place so full of sound, some sung, some spoken, and some stifled, it was the man who could not hear who had perhaps perceived the most. It is a mistake to think the deaf do not listen. Mr. Hobb, whose ears had failed but whose eyes had not, moved through the chapel with a watchfulness unencumbered by noise. He saw the rustle before the word, the tension before the step. He noticed when the hymn books were replaced too quickly or not at all. Father Brown, speaking gently with the vicar nearby, allowed himself no questioning, no clever deductions. Instead, he merely observed the observer. And something shifted. When Hobb passed through the vestry door and paused, just momentarily, beneath the bell rope, his hand flinched, not from fear, but from memory. It was emotion most would miss, but Father Brown did not miss it. Later, outside in the cloister walk where the wind muffled even ordinary conversation, Brown approached him, not with words, but with presence. He merely stood beside him, as if waiting for a storm to pass. And Hobb, though deaf, turned slowly, as if he had heard something after all. Or perhaps not a sound, but an understanding. The priest had never been skilled in sign language, and Hobb never pretended to be fluent in lip reading. Yet something between them moved, slow, reverent, and imperfect as prayer. Brown gestured once to the bell tower. Hobb's brow tightened. The priest nodded slowly, then raised one hand, palm upward, toward the sky. The verger stared, then looked down as though the ground had once spoken, and was doing so again. With one finger he bent down and began to draw in the dust that settled beneath the chapel wall. Not letters, not diagrams, only lines, soft, deliberate, broken like song. One line curved upward, then fell. Another came from the left, intersecting. Brown followed with his eyes alone, and when Hobb glanced up, he found not interrogation, but invitation. A final mark, a circle, small and placed near the base, was drawn, then swept away again by Hobb's sleeve, not out of denial, but out of sorrow. And the priest, watching the erasure, knew a memory had just been spoken in the only language left to the man who had once seen but never heard, the fall. There are truths that require no words, and Hobb's truth came not in statement, but in shape. The chapel wall behind them bore a vine of ivy that trembled faintly, though no wind stirred. Beside it, Brown stood still, his expression unreadable, as the verger pointed, first to the bell tower, then to the space below. Then slowly, Hobb placed both hands on his chest, opened them as if releasing a dove, and pointed toward the eastern window. A shadow, he seemed to say, a movement, after. Brown's eyes narrowed slightly, but only with attention. He drew one hand across his forehead, then downward, a priest's mimicry of dissent. Hobb nodded once, emphatically. He had not seen the fall, but he had seen what followed. And it was not the boy. Brown's hand paused on the stone pillar. "You saw someone leave," he said gently. Hobb nodded again. "From the tower?" Another nod. Then, hesitantly, a gesture, small, curling, uncertain. "Claver?" The verger paused, then slowly, very slowly, shook his head. And in that motion, Father Brown felt the case change direction, not away from guilt, but away from the obvious. For days the villagers had said they'd heard it, Claver's mournful hymn, drifting from the organ loft near midnight. They'd spoken of ghostly music, of lamentations that did not belong to any page. But now, as Hobb traced invisible chords in the air, Father Brown watched carefully and said nothing. He let the verger finish, then raised both hands with a simple gesture. "Did you hear?" Hobb looked puzzled for a moment, then pointed to his own ears, shaking his head. Brown made a motion toward the organ, and again, nothing. Not played, not at all. A silence had been remembered as music. And that, thought Father Brown, was perhaps the most dangerous silence of all, the kind that fills itself with what we expect to hear. He turned to the door of the vestry, where Claver had often sat in those same late hours, and wondered who had told the story of that midnight music. If it had not been played, then it had been imagined. And if imagined, by whom? And for what reason? Father Brown lingered long after Hob had returned to his duties, his broom brushing quietly against old stone. The priest leaned against the chapel wall, his eyes closed, not from weariness, but from the strange clarity that often came with closing out the world. Silence, he thought, was not the absence of speech. It was its distortion. It did not lie, precisely, but it permitted lies to flourish where words might have failed them. The organ had not spoken, the bell had not rung, and the boy's song had been stopped before it could finish. And yet the village had filled the silence, with stories, with fears, with music that had never sounded, but that still echoed in their minds. He opened his eyes. There are witnesses who see and cannot hear. There are listeners who hear what was never said. And somewhere between them is the truth, still cloaked, still humming, still waiting to be sung aloud. Father Brown turned toward the choir stalls. If the answer was not in the notes, then it must be in the breath that came before them, and that, he knew, was where he must next listen. It is a curious trait of human devotion that it clings more tightly to form when meaning begins to slip. The feast of St. Cecilia proceeded not because it could, but because it must. The rituals were rehearsed, the cassocks pressed, the incense weighed with the same mechanical reverence as the year before. Yet no one spoke of the absence, though all knew where it sat. Thomas's stall had been left untouched, not out of forgetfulness, but out of refusal. The choir boys averted their eyes as they passed it, and even Claver, now returned to his duties, avoided that space with the instinct of a man avoiding an unmarked grave. Father Brown stood at the threshold, small and still, watching the rehearsals not as a participant, nor as a judge, but as something stranger, a witness to a drama whose author had yet to be revealed. In the choir's rising notes he did not hear joy, or faith, or mourning. He heard an echo of something that had not yet been spoken, a sound still missing, a harmony disturbed not by dissonance but by fear. Claver had returned to the organ with a heaviness that did not come from guilt, but from history. He played not as a composer, but as a mourner arranging stones at a graveside. His canticle, entitled simply Ad Memoriam, was neither traditional nor wholly modern. It wove fragments of ancient plain song with harmonies that trembled at their own boundaries. The music did not comfort, it unsettled. Even the vicar, otherwise generous in his liturgical tastes, remarked that it felt strangely unanchored. But Claver said nothing. He merely adjusted the key a semitone down and played again. Father Brown stood near the font, listening, not to the melody, but to the silences it avoided. He watched Claver's hands, which trembled not from uncertainty, but from restraint. It was a piece written for grief, but there was something else buried within it, something clawing its way up through the bars. Not malice, but mourning made unclean by confusion. The priest did not move, he did not speak. But he understood that in Claver's music, as in his sorrow, the thing most absent was not the boy. It was innocence. As the canticle wound itself through the old bones of the chapel, the choir sang with a peculiar tension, like men reciting last rites, while still uncertain who the body belonged to. The stained glass figures above watched with eternal composure. Cecilia, serene amid her martyrdom, Michael, caught forever in the swing of justice. Father Brown stood in the nave, not watching the choir's mouths, but their eyes. There is a moment in every performance when the sacred gives way to the human, when the voice falters and the soul slips through. It is in that moment that truth, like a thread from heaven, may be caught. And so he watched not the choirmaster, not Claver, not the congregation, but the smallest boys whose understanding was not yet dulled by repetition. One sang too quietly, but with closed eyes, another clenched his fists beneath the robe, and a third, just beneath the stained glass martyr, sang well, but his eyes darted toward the western wall where the bell tower loomed. Brown noted each movement, not as evidence, but as signs of something out of tune, not in pitch, but in conscience. He did not smile. He waited. It happened near the end of the second refrain. The canticle rose in minor thirds, a phrase echoing something ancient yet unfinished. The choir's voices hovered like incense, but one voice cracked, not from strain but from something quieter and colder. The boy, Michael Alling, a chorister of modest talent but remarkable posture, missed his note, and with it his gaze slipped, not downward but upward, toward the east window, not in reverence, but in alarm. It lasted only a second, but in that second something shifted. Another boy, silent now, stared not at the music, but at the glass, and behind the glass, perhaps, at memory. Father Brown saw it, not the gaze, but the break in rhythm, the fracture in the ritual. And in that moment, the chapel felt less like a sanctuary and more like a stage where something unscripted had taken root. The priest folded his hands. It is often not the scream, but the flinch that betrays where a soul has been struck. The rehearsal ended, but the tension remained, trailing the choir boys like smoke too long in the lungs. They filed out in order, robes brushing one another like whispers exchanged in fear. Claver remained behind, silent before the organ, hands resting on the keys, though no music stirred. Father Brown did not speak. Instead, he turned toward the side aisle and bent, slowly, where the dust had gathered thickest beneath the rear pews. There, unnoticed by most, a faint impression had been made, a shoe, smaller than a man's, pressing inward where it should not have stood. He traced it gently with one finger, then looked up, his gaze resting not on the floor, but on the light. Sunlight, filtered through stained glass, fell at an angle peculiar to the hour, and in that light, upon the northern wall just above the choir's stall, was a faint mark, chalky, brief, like something rubbed quickly from a slate. A finger dragged downward, not writing, not decoration, a mark of presence and absence. The priest stood slowly, his eyes following the direction of the stain, not outward, but inward, toward the place where song meets memory and memory refuses to resolve. The rehearsal's echoes had not yet settled when Father Brown touched Claver lightly on the shoulder. The musician did not flinch. He only turned, slowly, as one might turn when addressed in a dream. "Mr. Claver," said Brown gently, "might we speak in the vestry?" There was no accusation in the voice, only something softer than suspicion and far more difficult to refuse. Claver nodded once. They walked together past the choir stalls, past the boy's empty seat, past the altar. The vestry door closed behind them with the sound not of secrecy but of sanctuary. For a moment neither spoke. Then Father Brown turned, not sharply, but with the deliberate care of a man choosing the right hymn in a book full of misleading titles. "I don't believe you harmed the boy," he said. Claver looked up, startled not by the words, but by the clarity with which they were spoken. "But I do believe," Brown continued, "that you saw something." The silence that followed was not defensive. It was the silence of someone who had carried a truth too long unspoken because it had no place in any song ever written. There are silences that accuse and silences that forgive. But in the vestry that afternoon, the silence merely waited, unmoving, as the cassocks that hung above like unused vestments of forgotten saints. The narrow room was thick with the scent of beeswax and old incense, as if even the walls had once prayed. Mr. Kelling sat hunched on the low wooden chair, his back stiff, but his hands restless, knotting themselves as though reciting a rosary of doubts. Across from him, Father Brown remained unassuming, his round face composed not with detachment, but with a sympathy too patient to speak first. "I suppose," Kelling said at last, his voice thin and dry, "you think me a monster." Brown blinked slowly. "No," he replied. "I think you are a man who once loved music more than men, and found himself caught between them." The choirmaster did not answer, but something in him slackened, as if an inner key had finally been turned. Outside, the wind stirred faintly, and the sound of a bell, still broken, did not ring. But inside the vestry a confession was beginning, without absolution, without conclusion, but with truth. "I found him in the tower," Kelling said, eyes fixed somewhere that was no longer in the room. He used to go there in the mornings before practice. I had thought it harmless. Some boys like heights, some crave silence. But I heard it once. He paused, as if words were insufficient currency to buy back the moment. "He was singing," he went on, "but not anything I had taught. No Gregorian line, no psalter or hymn from the Anglican shelf. It was his own. I recognized fragments of melody, but they wandered, dangerously so. They didn't return to their key." He frowned. It sounded free. Father Brown waited, but the pause lingered too long, and so he asked, "And that troubled you?" Kelling's mouth tightened, not in anger, but in memory. "It troubled me because he sang like he believed the notes came from somewhere higher than Scripture, as if the structure were beneath him." The priest said nothing. The choirmaster's hands were trembling now, not from fear, but from a memory too beautiful to trust. "It wasn't music anymore," Kelling whispered. "It was pride, pretending to be praise." "I wanted to stop it," Kelling said, his voice growing taut, "not because it was loud, but because it was wrong." He leaned forward, eyes darkened by something deeper than shame. The way he sang, it wasn't reverent, it was bold. It reached upward not with humility, but with audacity, as if heaven should answer him. Father Brown nodded slightly. "Many saints have been misunderstood for the same thing." Kelling's face flickered. "He wasn't a saint," he said quickly. "He was a child, playing with fire and thinking it light. There are boundaries in sacred music, not to limit, but to protect." He crossed them. "And you believed that was sin?" The choirmaster hesitated. "I believed it was the beginning of sin. A seed planted too early. The notes were beautiful, but beauty can become its own idol." Father Brown, ever still, did not judge the words, but listened to the way they were spoken, not with hatred, but with grief, like a man who had heard an angel sing and feared it might be a devil. "I confronted him," Kelling said, voice breaking for the first time. "I told him the tower was off limits, that no one had leave to climb alone, but he smiled. My God, he smiled, and said the tower was the only place where the music didn't echo back lies." The man's head dropped, the weight of that phrase seeming to settle on his shoulders like ashes. "I tried to correct him. I told him worship needed form, not flair. He replied that worship needed only truth, even if it hurt. And he sang again." There was silence. Then Kelling said quietly, "I told him to stop." Father Brown's face remained unreadable, but something in his eyes moved, like a candle guttering in prayer. He said, Kelling continued, that the bell wouldn't ring because it was tired of dishonest songs, that God had left the chapel and gone up into the sky. "And you struck him?" Brown asked, the words gentle, as if inviting, not accusing. Kelling's jaw trembled. "I don't remember it like that," he murmured. "I remember reaching for the rope. I remember shouting. I remember something slipping, not a blow, but a break, as if all the wrong notes finally collapsed at once." "It wasn't meant to be like that," Kelling said, his voice hollow now, as though echoing down the very tower he described. "I didn't plan it. I didn't even touch him. At least, I think I didn't." His hands clawed through his hair, as though trying to find the moment again and recompose it properly. "There was shouting, yes, and my hand on the rope, trying to pull it down, to bring the bell to life, to prove something, I don't know what. But the floor shook. He stumbled. He caught at the edge and missed." Brown raised one hand slowly, not to stop the confession, but to slow its descent. "It wasn't murder," Kelling said fiercely, as if insisting to God. "It was righteousness gone wrong, a correction that turned into a catastrophe." "Holiness," murmured the priest, "becomes heresy when it forgets to kneel." Kelling's breath hitched. "And I told no one," he said, "because how could I? Who would believe that the bell did not ring because the boy's truth was too loud for it?" Brown said nothing, but he looked, very quietly, toward the door. "There's something worse," Kelling said, barely audible. "Worse than what happened. Worse than what I did." Father Brown waited. "It's that I still hear him," Kelling whispered. "Sometimes in dreams, sometimes when the wind moves through the tower, not screaming, singing, as if he forgave me before he even fell." He rubbed his eyes, which were dry. "That's the punishment. Not prison, not disgrace, but being loved by the one you destroyed." Brown rose slowly, not in condemnation, but as one rising from a pew after long prayer. "The Church has many names for sin," he said softly, "but fewer names for mercy, and none for silence." He walked to the door, but paused with his hand on the frame. "You were not evil, Mr. Kelling," he said, "but you forgot that a child's voice, however imperfect, may still be closer to heaven than the polished tones of those who think they're already there." The choirmaster looked down, and as the door creaked open, the vestry once again filled with silence. Not the silence of concealment, but of something waiting to be forgiven. When Mr. Kelling emerged from the vestry, no hand gripped his wrist, no constable shadowed his step, and yet none mistook him for a free man. He walked slowly beside the vicar, his gait neither proud nor bowed, but that peculiar bearing of a soul newly hollowed. The children had been quietly dismissed. Even the sacristan seemed to understand that silence, not justice, was the appropriate liturgy of the moment. There was no crowd, only a hush, as if the chapel itself had agreed not to echo. Father Brown watched from the far end of the nave, his hat still held respectfully in his hand. He made no motion to intercept, no gesture to instruct. For there are crimes that require punishment, and others that require understanding. And once in a rare while there is one that merely requires a long walk through one's own conscience, unaccompanied by applause or accusation. Kelling passed beneath the threshold and into the grey daylight, carrying nothing but a truth he could not return. Afterwards, when the church had folded itself once more into its ancient stillness, Father Brown remained, not to inspect nor to correct, but to kneel. He did so not before the altar, but before the rough stones near the chapel's side wall, beneath the icon of St. Cecilia, whose painted mouth, though silent, seemed forever mid-song. It was a place Thomas had once knelt when no one watched. The little priest did not pray for Kelling's soul, nor even for the boy's. He prayed, instead, for those who would never understand either, for the righteous who mistake structure for spirit, and for the wounded who mistake freedom for truth. His prayer had no words. For some sins and some mercies lie beyond the reach of petition. He merely stayed until his knees ached and his breath moved in rhythm with something deeper than thought. And somewhere beyond the sacristy wall, the wind stirred the bell rope slightly. It did not ring, but it moved. Later, seated in the chapel's shadowed porch, Father Brown fingered the rim of his hat absent-mindedly, his gaze turned not outward, but inward. "Odd," he murmured to no one in particular, "how those who shout about sin often hear nothing of grace." There had been shouting, Kelling's, the vicar's once, even Thomas's voice in its own way. But never, to his recollection, had the bell itself raised its voice. And perhaps that had been the trouble. He thought of saints who had whispered to God and heard thunder, and others who had bellowed into the void and received only stillness. The silence, it seemed, did not always conceal. Sometimes it chose not to reply. He closed his eyes, not in weariness, but in reverence. Some truths, after all, were not for argument. They were only for knowing. The final Mass was sung the next morning. The choirboys lined up as they had always done, their robes freshly laundered, their voices warmed by water and worry. But there was a space among them, not a gap in the line, but a presence in the absence. No one mentioned it, but each boy sang with an unusual attentiveness, as if fearful that any misstep might fail to honor what was now unsaid. They sang not loudly, but truly. The Gloria soared not like a declaration, but like a shared remembrance, rising into the rafters like breath returned to God. Even the younger boys, prone to distraction, seemed seized by a strange solemnity, as though their youth had momentarily glimpsed eternity. Father Brown listened from the rear pew, hands folded over his knees. He did not look at the conductor, nor at the empty place beside the altar. He listened only to the unity, the music that asked no questions and needed no solos. Some voices, it seemed, became more powerful when taken up by others. Even a silence could be sung. When the Mass concluded, Claver sat a moment longer at the organ bench. His hands hovered above the keys, then fell, softly, not with command, but with release. The notes that followed were not of triumph, nor of judgment. They meandered gently through minor chords, weaving no melody, and yet saying something all the same, not remember, but let go. It was the sort of requiem that forgave without approving, and mourned without naming, not a song of blame, but of the deep, dignified sorrow that lingers in a cathedral after the crowds have left. Father Brown, still seated, closed his eyes. In that fragile harmony, suspicion itself seemed to exhale, finally spent. There were no apologies in the music, but neither were there accusations. The notes faded not with crescendo, but with something like peace. And for the first time in days, the chapel did not feel broken. It simply felt human. When the last echoes of the organ dissolved into stone, the boys filed out quietly, their voices hushed by something larger than silence. Father Brown stepped into the churchyard, hat in hand, and tilted his face upward. The clouds, which had brooded like judges since the feast began, had begun to shift, not with spectacle, but with reluctance, like old misunderstandings parting just enough to let the sky be blue again. He breathed in slowly. The air was still cool, but no longer cold. The bell remained still above him, the rope untouched, but in that moment it did not feel defiant, only patient. A few children ran past the gate, laughing, not because they had forgotten, but because they had remembered enough to let joy back in. Brown smiled faintly. There are days when the sky clears not with thunder, but with the quiet forgiveness of small souls who never stopped singing, and somewhere, behind the clouds, something had heard them. Father Brown stood beneath the bell tower once more, not gazing at its rope, but listening to the stillness it implied. In the shaft of daylight that penetrated the low arch, he did not expect sound, only significance. The place where Thomas fell was marked by a dark stain in the flagstones, and Father Brown placed his palm lightly upon it, as one might upon a closed grave, not to desecrate, but to commune. He closed his eyes. In that loss of sight, meaning grew sharper. No echo disturbed the hush, yet the air vibrated with absence. It was not silence of emptiness, but silence of something unfinished. He could feel the boy's final note hanging in the stones, unclaimed and unrepentant. He rose and turned slowly toward the nave, noting how the chapel, though still, felt closer to breathing. Each footstep carried the weight of conscience. He thought of how the rope had been frayed not by time, but by trembling devotion, and how the boy had ascended not to ring, but to listen. Father Brown did not move toward the rope. He moved away from noise and toward revelation, knowing that meaning often hides not in what breaks, but in what remains whole. He found the vicar lingering near the font, head bowed as though in private prayer. Father Brown approached and spoke softly. "I heard it, you know." The vicar looked up, surprise in his eyes. "The cry?" "No," said Father Brown, his voice even. His cry was not fear, it was a hymn. The priest paused, then shook his head slowly. "A hymn? I thought he fell crying out in terror." Brown smiled faintly. "So did I, but listen more closely. That note, not a scream but an expression, it lacked panic. It lacked resistance. It sought passage. It sought release. They stood side by side while the chapel remained still. Beauty, the priest added after a time, misunderstood by those who hear only its echo. That, said Brown, is often the beginning of guilt. He glanced upward at the tower's open arch and lowered his gaze, not in shame or condemnation, but in recognition. For some hymns are too pure to be judged by fear, and some voices too innocent to be drowned by sorrow. Father Brown reflected on how often purity unsettled the proud. The most innocent of melodies, he mused, could feel like accusation to those who believed themselves faultless. And so it was here. Thomas's note did not threaten life, but exposed those who lived for control. What fear is greater than pride, pierced by innocence? He recalled how Mr. Kelling had recoiled from the boy's improvisation as though it were a blade, how Claver had wept at silence imagined, and how the village, clinging to order, had recoiled at a freedom it could not name. Perhaps, said Brown quietly, we fear too much that a child might know more than we do. The vicar nodded, eyes thoughtful. We protect tradition by silencing its challengers. But tradition survives only when it listens, said the priest softly, and purity survives only when it is unafraid. Father Brown placed a hand on the stone wall, his fingers tracing its grain. He could feel in it the history of men both wise and foolish, and he knew that the boy's voice had done nothing more harmful than wake those who slumbered in certainty. When the final gathering came, it was not called a requiem, but it was one. The chapel filled again, this time with an assembly more reflective, less rehearsed. Faces were lined not with accusation, but with attendance, not pity, but presence. Claver stood at the organ, fingers brushing the keys as though greeting old friends. The choirboys took their places with solemnity, and the front stall remained empty, not from sorrow alone, but from reverence. Father Brown sat quietly amid them, hat resting in his lap, eyes travelling to the tower, as though seeking the one voice they all missed. Then Claver played, not a tune of guilt, not a melody of blame, just simple chords, resonant and peaceful. The music did not fill the chapel so much as release it from its own tensions. It was neither triumph nor defeat, but something quieter. Communion, not condemnation. And as the notes rose, no one spoke of fault, no one demanded justice, and no one sought closure. Some requiems do not seek an end but a beginning. After the final notes dissolved, the congregation lingered in an almost sacred hush. No one moved for the rope. No one called for the bell. And yet, in that stillness, something shifted. Father Brown felt it first, a gentle tremor in the stone beneath his feet. Then a sound, low, unhurried, but unmistakable. The bell. It tolled once, deep, honest, and forgiving. Long enough to reach the walls, short enough not to linger as accusation, but to affirm that all things that can ring may eventually answer. The priest rose from his seat, hat in hand, as if accepting an invitation rather than commanding attention. Others did likewise, some with tears, others with quiet smiles, not rejoicing but relief. The bell tolled a second time, echoing through rafters and hearts alike, and there was no tension. Only release. Father Brown stepped toward the tower door, then paused. "This bell," he murmured to the vicar, who stood beside him, "has remembered its own purpose." The priest nodded. "And perhaps," Brown continued softly, "has forgiven itself." They listened as the third toll faded, and, in its departure, heard not end, but absolution. Father Brown did not hurry to leave. He lingered in the nave, watching shadows lengthen, notes of the canticle and of the bell weaving together in the chapel's memory. Forgiveness, he knew, arises not from confession alone, nor from judgment, but from the space between. He turned toward the choir stalls, empty now, and thought of all who had sung, child, choirmaster, organist, and even those whose voices remained silent but present. Forgiveness, he reflected, is not a voice demanding repentance. It's a harmony that binds the broken, He thought of Thomas, who sang so boldly and yet fell so quietly, of Mr. Kelling, who struck from love misplaced, of Claver, who lamented without accusation, of the villagers who feared what they could not control. Each needed mercy, not as a reward, but as redemption. The priest left the chapel door open behind him, as though inviting both the sorrow and the song to follow. He stepped into the churchyard, where the sky had cleared. Somewhere in the distance, the breeze carried a low echo of the bell. Between note and silence, forgiveness breathed. Father Brown smiled, not because all was made clear, but because clarity, like grace, often arrives without fanfare. The last light of day lay across the chapel roof like a benediction. Father Brown stood for a long moment, his eyes tracing the golden patch, neither looking upward nor downward, but inward. The world remained unchanged outwardly, the clouds still gathering beyond the moor, the stones still cool with age, but something within it had softened. He closed his eyes and inhaled the scent of beeswax, moss, and distant incense, reminders that the sacred need not be distant from the everyday. Behind him the chapel stood silent, its bell rung but not shouted, its choir empty but not abandoned. A harmony settled in the spaces between stone and sky, song and stillness, sin and grace. When he opened his eyes, they rested on nothing remarkable. A quiet roof, a silent stone, a gentle breeze flickering through the chapel doors. No grand revelation, no parade of absolution. But perhaps, he thought, that was enough. He turned and walked away, hat in hand and heart at ease, leaving behind the final cry, now understood not as end, but as echo. And the chapel, in its quiet dignity, continued to remember what it had heard. Some truths, like the toll of a bell, are clearest when they're not heard, but felt, resonating not through stone, but through the soul. And you, if you had heard that final hymn echoing through the tower, would you have judged it as pride or recognized it as grace unspoken? Tell me in the comments. I'd love to read your thoughts. If you enjoyed this mystery, leave a like, share it with someone curious, and don't forget to subscribe for more timeless enigmas.